The husband mocked in court, "You're as much a doctor as I am a ballerina." But the judge's verdict surprised not only him but also his wife and the entire courtroom. The sun timidly filtered through the high windows of the courtroom, casting trembling streaks of light on the polished wooden paneling. Tension hung thick in the air, and Jenna, a fragile woman in a strict dark blue suit, felt it in every fiber of her being. Her heart pounded wildly, trying to push away the anxiety tightening around her chest. To be honest, Jenna was not used to being the center of attention, especially in such a context. Her stronghold had always been the operating room, the place where she felt confident and at ease. But here, in the courtroom, Jenna felt vulnerable, like a surgeon deprived of their practice. She let her gaze drift across the room, searching for something, anything, to ground herself. Too many unfamiliar faces, all waiting for one thing, a fair trial and a guilty verdict. At the front of the room, behind a long table, sat the judge. On either side of him, the attorneys. Their faces were unreadable, like masks. And directly across from her was Nicholas, her ex-husband. The man she had once loved with all her heart. The one she had trusted more than herself. Now, he was her opponent, her accuser, and the embodiment of all her fears in one person. His gaze, once so warm, was now cold as ice. It made sense, of course. They had divorced 7 months ago, at Nicholas's initiative, after he set his sights on yet another beauty who had joined his firm as an intern. It seemed like he wasn't even looking at his former wife, but Jenna still felt his presence, burning, contemptuous, as if he had already sentenced her in his mind. Jenna still remembered how she had met her future husband. She had been a young, hopeful medical student, dreaming of saving lives, while Nicholas was determined to defend people's rights in and out of court. It had seemed like fate had written their story. Nicholas had been so proud of her skills, her determination, her talent. "Jenna, you're a born surgeon," he had told her. "You have golden hands." The hearing soon began, and she felt the ground slip from under her feet. A sharp, uncompromising voice accused her of negligence, of professional recklessness, of allegedly making a fatal mistake that had led to a patient's death. Jenna listened carefully, not wanting to miss a single detail. She knew she wasn't guilty. She knew she had done everything in her power, fought for that life until the very last moment. But how could she prove it to those who had already passed their silent judgment on the disgraced doctor? Nicholas spoke clearly, confidently, and each word cut deeper than the last. And yet, as an experienced lawyer, he should have known that the truth is often far more complex than it seems. But Nicholas probably just wanted to boost his reputation at the expense of his ex-wife. As always. "Your Honor," he continued, looking directly at the elderly judge, but Jenna knew every word was meant for her, "I believe that Ms. Jenna Russell's professionalism is highly questionable. Her carelessness and negligence during surgery led to the tragic death of a patient who had placed their helpless life in her hands. I simply cannot understand how such a mistake could have been made." Jenna clenched her fists, trying to hold back the overwhelming emotions. She knew full well that her words would come across as excuses, pitiful attempts to avoid punishment. After the prosecutor's speech, the judge turned to Jenna. "Jenna, do you want to say something?" She raised her eyes and looked at him. She needed to speak, but her throat tightened. The words seemed to hang on the tip of her tongue. Jenna struggled to force herself to speak. "I want to say, I am not guilty. I did everything I could." "That's not enough," Nicholas replied harshly, not taking his eyes off her, as though expecting her defeat. He stepped closer and whispered, so that only his ex-wife could hear. "You're as much of a doctor as I am a ballerina." Jenna's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She held them back in time, pulling a handkerchief from her pocket. She didn't want Nicholas to feel her weakness and revel in her emotional pain. Jenna took a deep breath and turned away, trying to pull herself together. "The court is ready to hear further witness testimony in this case," said the judge, interrupting the heavy silence. "However, given the complexity of the situation and the need for a thorough examination of all the circumstances, the hearing is postponed for 1 month. During this time, Jenna Russell will continue her work, but under the supervision of regulatory authorities. A final decision will be made after a full investigation of all the facts. Jenna left the building feeling empty. She understood that she had 1 month to gather evidence of her innocence while the entire medical community would be watching her. It would be a time of constant tension, a time of anxiety. But most importantly, Jenna couldn't betray the trust of the department head, Joshua Richardson, and implicate, even indirectly, anesthesiologist Brian Wood, who had just had triplets. In Jenna's opinion, it was his fault the patient's condition had worsened. On the other hand, it was unlikely that could be called a medical error. An operation under general anesthesia was no easy task, and not every doctor was 100% sure of success when starting one. But everyone believed in Jenna's success, from the nurse to the department head or even the chief doctor. Her medical reputation had been impeccable. How could it have been otherwise when Jenna had known since childhood that she would become a surgeon? Once, back in 3rd grade, she and her parents had gone to the city fair, where, in celebration of the holiday, several attractions had been opened, carousels, slides, and various contests for valuable prizes. Among them stood out one called Fate Prediction. It looked like a huge refrigerator, with a portrait of an elderly fortune teller in a headscarf and holding a cane. The rules were simple and enticing. You put a coin into a special slot, the mechanism activated, and with a cheerful click, it returned a paper ticket with a so-called fate prediction from the mechanical prophet. "Well, what did you get, Jenna?" her mother asked with a smile, peeking over her shoulder. Jenna opened her hand, and her parents saw a single phrase, "You will become a doctor." "Well, now it's practically a sign from God that you should continue the family legacy in medicine," her father, who worked as a paramedic at the emergency station, smiled. Her mother also had a connection to the medical field, although she never worked in it professionally. Ava had realized in time that she loved books more than nursing, and became a librarian at the school. It was her mother who instilled in Jenna a thirst for knowledge, helping her prepare for the entrance exams. Remembering this now, Jenna involuntarily relaxed her hand, expecting to see the little ticket from the magical machine. I wonder what the mechanical prophet would say now. Maybe Jenna was mistaken, maybe she had misinterpreted the answer. But the message was written clearly, "You will be a doctor." As she was leaving the courthouse, Jenna spotted her ex-husband. Nicholas smirked. "There's always someone who'll do all the dirty work for you, isn't there, Jenna?" His words cut deeper than a scalpel. "It's so typical of you surgeons, always shifting the responsibility onto others." "I've never done that," Jenna blurted out, her voice cracking. "I'm not guilty." Nicholas raised an eyebrow in surprise, clearly not expecting such an emotional response from her. "And yet the patient died," he said coldly, giving her an assessing look. "And you're still free, not even stripped of your medical license." "Well, don't worry, I'll have your whole gang in court soon enough. You all think you're so untouchable, hiding behind your surgeries." Jenna remained silent, fully aware of what her ex-husband was trying to do. He was surely trying to provoke her, to get under her skin so the omnipresent reporters could capture her, ready to claw at his hair. "Look, they're already lurking around the corner with a camera, just waiting for any slip-up. Say something out of line, and she'd be on the evening news." Every journalist had their own source of income, and for them, it was all about sensationalism and scandal. Jenna knew this well, understanding that if she let herself lose control, she'd ruin not only herself, but also those who had been involved in that ill-fated surgery. Many had initially believed the patient was doomed, but Jenna had taken the risk, hoping to alleviate his suffering and give him hope. And what did she get in return? A court trial with the potential to lose her beloved job. She also knew that this next month would be the hardest of her life. "Jenna." "Wait," called a familiar voice. It was a young intern who worked in her department. "Christopher? What are you doing here?" Jenna asked, trying to hide her anxiety. "I came to support you," the young doctor answered, looking her directly in the eyes. "I know you're not guilty. I saw with my own eyes how hard you fought for that patient's life. I think it was just a tragic accident. Thank you, Jenna whispered, and her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. You know, I happened to overhear what your ex-husband said, Christopher continued, lowering his voice. It was awful. I think he just wants to get revenge on you. Maybe, she sighed. Or maybe he just wants to win the case. After all, he's a lawyer. It doesn't matter right now. Just trust me when I say I really am not guilty. Of course, Jenna, the intern replied. I believe you. I know you're the best surgeon in our hospital, and I'm sure you'll prove your innocence. Jenna smiled faintly, but it was a sad and uncertain smile. She knew that she would have to fight for her reputation, career, and personal future. Her thoughts were interrupted by Christopher's voice, kindly offering his hand. Come on, I'll walk you to the clinic. Jenna nodded, and they slowly walked down the sidewalk. It was hard to walk in silence. Don't worry, everything will be fine. I'm sure of it. Jenna, I've seen you save lives. There's no doubt about you. The intern's voice was sincere, filled with a kind of youthful confidence. Thank you, Christopher, but I'm afraid that's not enough. They turned into the park that stretched along the street, and suddenly Jenna noticed how much it had changed. The first buds appeared on the trees, and the air was filled with freshness and the light scent of spring. You know, I'd like to tell you something. Christopher suddenly hesitated. What is it? Jenna looked at him. It's about my brother, Jonathan. The future doctor fell silent, carefully choosing his words. What about him? Jenna asked quietly, a bad feeling growing inside her. Well, he was diagnosed with some serious health problems. Christopher lowered his eyes. He didn't want to go to doctors for a long time, but eventually he had to. What exactly? Jenna asked, her voice taking on a professional tone. Her medical instincts took over her personal emotions. I don't know, he won't say, Christopher sighed. He's kind of detached from all of this. Detached? But why? Jenna couldn't understand how someone could ignore health problems. The thing is, Jonathan doesn't really believe in medicine, the intern admitted shyly. He thinks it's all just doctors' nonsense. That's why he tries to treat himself with alternative methods, herbs, yoga. Jenna stopped and looked at him in confusion. Christopher, but that's dangerous. And you, as a future doctor, surely understand that. I know, he looked at Jenna with sadness. I really tried to convince my brother, but Jonathan won't listen. He doesn't listen to anyone, really. He's so stubborn. What does your brother do? Jenna asked, trying to shift the conversation to distract herself and her companion from the somber thoughts. He owns a chain of restaurants, Christopher replied. A pretty successful businessman. He's also into horses. There's a stable outside the city. Elite racehorses. All top-notch. That's good, Jenna responded. But why doesn't he trust doctors? Was there some kind of incident? I don't think so. Probably just his own beliefs, Christopher shrugged again. But right now, that doesn't matter, because he needs help. You know, our parents died in a car accident when my older brother was still in school and I was in kindergarten. Jonathan was in the car with them. He hit his head. He doesn't remember anything from his childhood. It's like it was erased. The only thing that saved him was that Jonathan was in the back seat and the front of the car was completely crushed. Since then, our grandmother, Grace, has taken care of us. It's a shame my brother's memory never came back. Christopher, let me try talking to your brother. Jenna suddenly felt a surge of energy. Maybe this was her chance to prove she was a good doctor. A chance to save another life. I'll see what I can do. Are you serious? Hope flickered in Christopher's eyes. But It doesn't matter, Jenna said firmly. Tell Jonathan that I'm ready to see him at any time. Be sure, I'll do everything I can. They continued walking along the path, covered with the dry leaves of last year. Apparently, the janitor was a bit slow and hadn't cleaned up. Christopher was silent for a while, as though thinking over her offer. "Thank you, Jenna," he finally said. "I'm sure that if anyone can convince my brother, it's you. Jonathan is also a very strong person, but right now he's just given up." "That's not strength," Jenna countered. "That's foolishness, but I understand why he behaves that way. Fear is a very powerful emotion." "Probably," the intern said quietly, and they stepped onto the sidewalk where cars were already moving by. They walked on, enjoying the silence and the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves. Jenna listened to Christopher's story, and it seemed like she was starting to understand his mysterious brother, the one who stubbornly refused medical help. Mentally, Jenna even felt sympathy for him, as a patient tangled in his own beliefs. But she also felt a strange, inexplicable anxiety. Something told her that their meeting would not be an easy one. "What kind of restaurants does your brother have?" Jenna asked, trying to distract herself from the persistent thoughts. "Oh, all sorts," Christopher answered with a smile. "There are classic ones, some with a creative twist, and even one with molecular cuisine. Jonathan is always coming up with something new. He's just talented." "Wow!" Jenna exclaimed, a light smile forming on her lips. "I'd love to visit one of them sometime." "You definitely should, Jenna," Christopher promised. "Of course," she agreed. "Well, here we are." "Jenna," Christopher extended his hand, "I'll be waiting for news, and I'll make sure to tell my brother about you." "Okay, thank you for walking me here." She looked into the intern's eyes. "And don't worry so much about your brother. Everything will be fine." "I'll try," Christopher said with hope, and with a broad smile, hurried into the clinic. Jenna watched him until he disappeared, then turned her gaze to the building that had given her the chance to enter the medical field as a doctor. The clinic greeted her with its usual hustle and bustle, nurses rushing here and there, doctors talking, the scent of antiseptics. But today, the atmosphere felt especially tense. Jenna could feel the scrutinizing gazes of her colleagues, their eyes full of interest. It was as if they were silently asking, "So, how did the trial go?" In her office, the head of the department, Joshua, was nervously adjusting his glasses. He averted his gaze when Jenna entered and began speaking cautiously, as though carefully choosing his words. "Jenna, you see, there's a situation here. The chief doctor, Jordan Thompson, doesn't want to cast a shadow over the clinic." Jenna felt her heart tighten painfully. She suddenly realized that the head of the clinic wouldn't support her. She could read it in his eyes. Yet, at the same time, a part of her still hoped that he would stand by her. "I understand," Jenna said calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll work my assigned time until the trial and then leave on my own." No, Jenna," Joshua quickly fussed. "Don't misunderstand me, we can't fire you, but until the situation is resolved, it's probably better for you to look for another job. We'll keep your position open for you." Jenna looked at him closely, trying to understand his true motives. He didn't want to fire her, but he wasn't in any hurry to continue working with her either. Jordan just wanted to quietly get rid of an inconvenient employee without tarnishing the clinic's reputation. "All right," she said quietly, "I understand." At that moment, Jenna noticed the anesthesiologist standing by the window, almost like a powerless observer. His eyes were sad, reflecting both guilt and relief at the same time. What upset Jenna the most was how easily her colleague had shifted the blame onto her shoulders, leaving her standing on the edge of a precipice. "Brian," Jenna quietly called. The anesthesiologist reluctantly turned toward her. His face wore a mask of feigned sympathy. "Jenna, you understand," he mumbled, not looking her in the eyes. "Brian, why did you do this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why did you let me take the blame?" "Jenna," he repeated, unable to find the right words, "I have triplets. You know how hard that is. You have triplets, and I'm losing my life." It slipped out of her before she could stop it. Jenna turned away, unwilling to hear any more of his excuses. She felt bitter and hurt. Her soul was tearing apart. She had tried to save him, and now he couldn't even look her in the eye. Fine, Jenna said, let's not talk about it. She left the office, feeling despair take hold of her. Jenna already knew she had to leave, but where could she go? Who would hire a doctor with a license at risk of being revoked? In the hallway, Christopher caught up with her. Jenna, Jonathan agreed to come. I called him and convinced him, the intern said quickly. Will you be able to see him tomorrow at around 10 a.m.? Oh, and I think I managed to find out his diagnosis. The one he was given at the private clinic. Yes, of course, Jenna replied, feeling a flicker of hope stirring inside her. I'll be waiting. The rest of the shift passed in a rushed, disconnected manner, but without incident. She didn't feel like going home, especially since their family house had gone to Nicholas in the divorce. It was foolish to think that an experienced lawyer would leave anything for his wife. The saying the shoemaker's children have no shoes certainly didn't apply to Nicholas. The next day, before her appointment, Jenna carefully prepared. She reviewed all the materials related to Jonathan's diagnosis and tried to calm her nerves. Exactly at 10 a.m., there was a knock at the door. She opened it, and there stood a tall, broad-shouldered man. His gaze was sharp and distrustful, and his face conveyed fatigue and resignation. It was Jonathan. Hello, Jenna said, trying to sound confident and friendly. Please, come in. Jonathan silently walked into the office and sat down on the chair. The businessman didn't look at Jenna, but she felt that he was assessing her. Christopher said, "You're a surgeon," the visitor finally spoke. "I'll be clear right from the start. I'm not really a believer in medicine." "I already understand," Jenna replied. "But I really want to help you." "You?" Jonathan bitterly smiled. "No offense, but I doubt you know what to do with me. In the private clinic, they just ran tests, one after another, and got nowhere. But they sure drained me of money. Don't get me wrong, I'm not greedy or poor. I just don't like wasting money on things that don't work." "Jonathan, this isn't a waste," Jenna said. "Don't forget, I'm a doctor, and I'll do everything I can to help you." "You won't help," Jonathan cut her off. "I've tried everything. Nothing works." "But you haven't tried this," Jenna said defiantly. "Let me examine you." Jonathan silently stared at her. In his eyes, there was nothing but contempt and exhaustion. "Fine," he said. "But don't expect a miracle." Right after that, Jenna conducted a thorough examination, asking many questions, listening closely to his responses, and recording everything in his medical chart. Jenna knew this wasn't an easy case, and she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "You really do have a rare condition," she concluded after finishing the examination. "But that doesn't mean there's no way to help you." "You think that's possible?" Jonathan asked, and for the first time, there was uncertainty in his voice. "Of course, what other way is there?" Jenna replied. "I know it will be tough, but I'm ready to fight for your health. We'll just need to do a detailed blood test. Not just yours, but Christopher's too." Jonathan's eyes flickered with something resembling surprise. But beyond that, the businessman saw in Jenna's gaze genuine care and a desire to help. It touched him. "All right," he said. "I agree. But remember, if I get any worse, it'll be your fault." "I won't let you down," Jenna answered firmly, sincerely hoping that the whole town didn't know yet about her recent court experience. The blood test for both brothers wasn't a coincidence. It was to rule out the possibility of cancer or, on the other hand, to prevent the development of a genetic disease. The meeting with Jonathan left her with mixed feelings. On one hand, she sympathized with him. On the other, she didn't understand how anyone could treat their health that way, believing in some alternative healers when surgery is the queen of medical sciences. The next day at the clinic, Jenna was reviewing the results. Everything was normal except for one thing, the level of certain proteins, which could indicate cancer. Jenna was puzzled but decided to do a repeat test to rule out any errors in the results. "Jenna, there's a lab expert here," the nurse knocked on the door. "They're asking for you to come to the lab." Jenna stepped out of the office, confused. She was greeted by a young but competent specialist. "Jenna," he began, "I wanted to discuss something with you." "Yes, I'm listening, Evan." She looked at her colleague with anxiety. "I double-checked the tests. There's something strange." "What exactly?" Jenna felt her heart race with worry. "The tests you took yesterday from the patient Jonathan and his brother Christopher," the expert lowered his voice, "there's a discrepancy. According to all the genetic markers, they aren't brothers." Jenna felt the blood drained from her face. "But how is that possible?" She whispered. "I checked several times. The results don't change. They are genetically unrelated. It's very strange. Normally, such things are immediately clear." Jenna froze, unable to move. She couldn't believe her ears. Christopher and Jonathan weren't brothers? Everything had pointed to the opposite. She desperately tried to remember every detail, every tiny aspect of her conversations with them. "Thank you, Evan," Jenna said, trying not to reveal her panic. "I'll look over the tests again." Back in her office, she opened the results once more. She carefully examined each line, searching for a mistake, but nothing changed. They really weren't brothers. But why? Why are they hiding this? Jenna whispered aloud. Or maybe they don't even know about it. Questions immediately began to swirl in her mind. Why had Christopher lied to her, and what was Jonathan's goal in all of this? She felt that behind this lie, there was something bigger. Something that might be quite dangerous. Taking a deep breath, Jenna decided to take action. She needed to find the truth. "Christopher, come to my office, please," she said into the intercom. A few minutes later, the door opened, and the intern entered the room. His eyes were filled with hope. "Jenna, how are the results?" he asked eagerly. "Any news?" "Christopher," Jenna looked at him directly. "I want to talk about your brother." "About Jonathan? What's wrong with him?" Christopher's face changed. "Tell me the truth," Jenna spoke slowly and clearly. "Is Jonathan really your biological brother?" Christopher froze. Confusion flashed across his face, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course," he answered, trying to remain calm. "What's wrong?" "Christopher," Jenna didn't raise her voice, but her tone became sharper. "Don't lie to me. I know you're not brothers." The young man's face drained of color. It was as if he stopped breathing and became like a fish thrown onto the shore. "I'm sorry, Jenna, but I don't understand what's going on. Maybe there's some mistake?" Jenna shook her head. "No, Christopher. Our Evan is a professional in his field. Don't even think about questioning his work, or you'll make an enemy of him. Considering you want to become a doctor, I don't think that will do you any favors." The intern visibly became flustered, realizing his mistake. After all, Jenna Russell's word meant something. Of course, her reputation had been tainted by the trial and accusations from the relatives of the deceased patient, but she had done everything she could despite the risks. The anesthesiologist's mistake had been fatal, no doubt about it. But on the other hand, the patient had even fewer chances. As the workday neared its end, while Jenna was once again trying to focus on a patient's medical history, the door to her office burst open with a rush. It was Grace, the grandmother of the brothers. Her face was aflame with anger, and her eyes were filled with contempt. "Are you Jenna?" The businesswoman began from the doorway. "Tell me, young lady, how dare you interfere in things that aren't your business?" Jenna looked up from her papers, surprised to see the visitor. She immediately recognized her. The rumors about this woman's insufferable personality were clearly not unfounded. "Hello," the doctor greeted politely, trying to maintain her composure. "You must be Grace? Is something wrong?" "Wrong?" The guest mocked her, walking closer to the desk and looming threateningly over the seated Jenna. "You've done such a thing that now the whole family is in an uproar. What business is it of yours who is a brother and who is a cousin? Are you a doctor or just a meddler in other people's skeletons?" Jenna leaned back in her chair, trying not to show her surprise and slight confusion. "I'm sorry. I don't quite understand what you're talking about," she said calmly, looking at Grace. "I simply asked Jonathan and Christopher to provide blood tests in order to get a full picture of their health. How could I have known it would turn out this way?" "Oh, really?" The woman smirked. "Well, I think you just wanted to dig into their dirty laundry. Don't you have your own life?" "Oh, that's right. Your husband left you. How could I forget? And then he even beat you in court." "Believe me," Jenna sighed tiredly. "I have so many problems right now that other people's skeletons are the last thing I care about. Let me remind you that my career and reputation are on the line. I'm trying to be a conscientious doctor, and the fact that I found a discrepancy in the test results is just a side effect of my work. It's crucial for making the correct diagnosis." "What diagnosis?" Grace snapped, narrowing her eyes. "Are you suggesting that such confidential information is related to health? Don't be ridiculous. Why did you need to dig this up? You young people are too curious and too sure of yourselves. You always poke your noses where you're not asked, and then wonder about the consequences." Jenna frowned. "I just wanted to help Jonathan. Christopher himself said he had a serious illness. From a medical perspective, the blood test showed some abnormalities, and now we need to conduct further tests." "My grandson will not do any more tests," Grace shouted, slamming her palm on the table. "No more tests. You've already caused enough trouble. That's enough. As a doctor, you should know that not everything should be uncovered. Some secrets should remain strictly personal." "But it's about health," Jenna argued. "I don't understand why you're reacting like this. Isn't he your grandson? I would think that you only want what's best for him. Right?" "My grandsons are perfectly healthy," the visitor spat. "And your interest," she pointed a dry finger at Jenna, "makes me suspicious. Remember, Jenna, if anything happens to my grandsons because of you, I will crush you. No, I'll bury you." A heavy silence hung in the air. Jenna sat stunned by the intensity of the emotions. What was the grandmother hiding? Why was she reacting so sharply to an ordinary medical procedure? But most importantly, why was she trying to hide the fact that Christopher and Jonathan might not be brothers? Suddenly, at the door, Grace grabbed her chest as if in sharp pain. "Should I call the nurse?" Jenna asked anxiously, noticing that the woman was turning pale and breathing heavily. "No need. I'm fine," Grace rasped, quickly heading for the exit and casting a hateful look at the doctor. "You'll regret this," she hissed as she left the office. "You're ruining my family." With that, the businesswoman slammed the door behind her, emphasizing her disdain for the surgeon. Jenna was left alone in her office, bewildered and downcast. She couldn't understand what had just happened and why an ordinary examination had triggered such a storm of emotions. Her mind raced to piece together this puzzle. What was Grace hiding? Why was she so afraid that Christopher and Jonathan might not be brothers? And what was this secret that could tear their family apart? Thoughts swirled in her head, preventing her from focusing. Suddenly, Jenna remembered how Nicholas had said in court that she was as much a doctor as he was a ballerina. She walked to the window and looked at the darkening sky. Heavy clouds hung over the city, as if predicting an imminent downpour. Her soul felt uneasy as well. Jenna knew she had to unravel this mystery, even if it cost her dearly. By evening, exhausted and drained, and after an unsuccessful operation, Jenna was walking home. The gray high-rises weighed heavily with their monotony, and the biting wind cut through to the bone. She turned the corner where elderly women usually fed pigeons with bread and saw a boy sitting on the sidewalk. He was crouched next to a cardboard box, and in his hands, he nervously held a small, fluffy ball, a puppy. The boy, thin and dirty, with frightened eyes, looked up as Jenna approached. He appeared no older than 9. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty. "Will you buy the puppy?" he asked quietly, avoiding eye contact. Jenna froze for a moment, looking at the small puppy that was timidly nudging the boy's hand with its nose. Something stirred inside her. She saw in those eyes the same despair and loneliness that she felt herself. How much? She played along with a smile. $1, the boy whispered, and a glimmer of hope flashed in his eyes. Jenna pulled out her wallet from her bag and took out a $10 bill. The boy's eyes widened. Wow, but I don't have change for that. I can't give you that much. Don't worry about it, Jenna smiled. This is all for you, and the puppy too. But the boy didn't know what to say. Tears welled up in his eyes. I really want this puppy, Jenna said softly, and I would be happy if you agreed to come visit me. We can have some tea and feed your pet. The boy, still not believing his luck, nodded and said in surprise, I agree. By the way, my name is Tyler. Nice to meet you. I'm Jenna, the woman introduced herself and extended her hand. After a brief pause, the boy shyly shook her hand. Jenna's apartment, modest and cozy, usually felt empty and cold, but now, as she opened the door and welcomed the guest, it seemed to fill with warmth. Without hesitation, Jenna ran a hot bath and found some clothes. Not hers, of course, but from her cousin Matthew, who sometimes visited. Go ahead and take a bath, and I'll put the kettle on, Jenna smiled and suggested. Tyler, still a bit shy, went to the bathroom. Meanwhile, Jenna filled a bowl with warm water and carefully bathed the puppy, dried it with a soft towel, and placed a bowl of milk next to it. When both of them, clean and fed, were sitting at the kitchen table, Tyler, looking at the puppy, asked, What should we call him? To be honest, I found him near the trash cans. Well, let's come up with a name together, Jenna suggested, smiling. They spent some time thinking about names until they finally settled on Charlie. The white puppy with dark spots on his face seemed to approve of his new name, happily wagging his tail. And you, Tyler, where are you from? Where do you live? Your parents? Jenna asked cautiously as she poured the boy a cup of hot tea. He hesitated for a moment, then quietly replied, I'm from the streets. I don't have anyone. I'm an orphan. Jenna's heart ached with pain. Although she wasn't an orphan herself, she knew that there were still children living on the streets. Jenna silently hugged Tyler, knowing that words were unnecessary in this moment. She told him about her work, how she saved lives, but unfortunately, things didn't always go as planned. She also shared her passion for old anatomy books, which she cherished and studied carefully in the evenings. Do you know why people get sick? Tyler asked, listening to her intently. Well, there are different kinds of illnesses, kiddo, Jenna began. Sometimes it's viruses, sometimes it's bacteria, and sometimes, she paused, thinking, it's just a medical mistake. A mistake? The boy asked again. Yeah, she nodded. Even doctors make mistakes. We're human, but we learn from our mistakes and try not to make the same ones again. The most important thing is to never give up. Although deep down Jenna wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep going, giving in to despair was indeed tempting. Fighting her ex-husband in court was like a suicide mission. Nicholas certainly wouldn't leave a stone unturned when it came to destroying her defense. Looking at Tyler again, she suddenly realized that this boy was special. He was the kind of son she should have had, the one who was never born because of her husband. That day, they had fought badly. Jenna was 2 months pregnant. She had gone outside to cool off after the argument, and she slipped on the icy steps of their house. The weather was terrible. In the end, she miscarried early, and the doctor's verdict was infertility with a 99% certainty. But what was the point of dwelling on that now? The evening passed quickly. Jenna tucked Tyler into bed on the couch, and looking at the peacefully sleeping boy, she felt a sense of calmness inside. Outside, the lights of the big city flickered, but in her small rented apartment, there was warmth and comfort, things she had been longing for in her life. Jenna drank another cup of tea, then opened her old anatomy book and immersed herself in studying the human body. The sudden ring of the doorbell startled her. Charlie lifted his head and perked up his ears. Jenna, surprised, opened the door and saw Christopher standing on her doorstep. "Jenna, sorry it's so late," the intern said apologetically. "I wanted to talk to you about Jonathan's tests." "Well, come in," she said, letting him into the apartment. "I have a guest, actually." Christopher looked at Tyler, who was peacefully sleeping on the couch, with surprise. "Who's this?" he asked quietly. "This is Tyler," Jenna answered. "I met him today on the street. He was selling a puppy." "I see," Christopher nodded, "so you're not having dinner alone anymore." "Yeah, you're right. So, what did you want to say?" Jenna didn't waste time. "It's still not completely clear," Christopher replied sadly. "I told Jonathan that we're not brothers. So, he hired a private detective to find out the truth, and Grandma Grace is against it. She says we should stop wasting time on nonsense." Jenna paused to think. Why was she so insistent on this? "Well, I don't know what to say, Christopher, but I think you and Jonathan need to be careful. Of course, your grandmother loves you, but with her insistence on resolving this matter, I feel like she's only making things worse. Believe me, I've seen a lot in my medical practice. Who knows, maybe one of you was switched in the maternity ward, for example, but how could we ever figure out which one?" Christopher shrugged and started preparing to leave, declining the tea she offered. In truth, he had only stopped by because he wanted to tell her about hiring a private detective. The next morning, Jenna was woken up by a phone call. It was the nurse on duty. "Jenna, Joshua urgently needs you. Something's wrong with Jonathan." Jenna quickly got dressed, made Tyler an omelet on the fly, and rushed to the clinic. The emergency room was chaotic. Joshua was waiting for her in his office, pale and agitated. "Jenna, Jonathan was brought in 2 hours ago by ambulance. He became ill during the night. Christopher says his condition has worsened sharply. He needs immediate surgery. I don't think I need to remind you of our previous conversation, do I?" Jenna felt her hands grow cold. "Prepare the operating room. I'll be in the on-call room." The patient was prepped for surgery rather quickly. Jenna acted quickly and confidently, as if in another world, one where there was no court, no accusations. She felt Jonathan's heart beating and understood that everything she was doing was not in vain. It was time to administer the anesthesia. Brian still stood next to her, nervously gripping the syringe. "Wait," Jonathan croaked, clutching Jenna's hand. His eyes widened in terror. "I need to tell you something very important. I remember everything. I never had a grandmother. My father was an orphan, and my mother's relatives left early." Jenna looked at the patient, confused. "Grace," Jonathan whispered faintly, "she worked as a maid and nanny for my parents. They died in an accident. I was in the car with them. The crash, the pain in my head, and then nothing else. She pretended to be my grandmother." Jonathan's consciousness began to fade, and then the businessman lost consciousness. "What's he talking about?" Brian asked, looking at Jenna in confusion. "I don't know," she replied. Blood rushed to Jenna's face as she realized the full meaning of what Jonathan had just said. "Let's keep going." "No time, we need to start." The surgery went smoothly, but throughout the whole time, Jenna couldn't shake off Jonathan's words. What did it all mean? Who exactly was Grace? Most likely, Christopher, due to his age, simply didn't know about this lie. But why were they not brothers? After the surgery, Jenna went to the on-call room. The intern was there, pale and frightened. "How's Jonathan?" he asked, looking at the doctor with pleading eyes. "Everything went well," Jenna reassured him. "Your brother will wake up soon." Christopher sighed with relief and sat down on a chair. "Jenna, I can't even begin to thank you. You have no idea how much this means." "It's nothing," Jenna sat down next to him. "Christopher, are you sure Grace is your grandmother?" He looked at her in surprise. "Of course, why?" "Jonathan told me something before the anesthesia." Christopher frowned. That's impossible. I've known her as my grandmother since childhood. I was always told she was my father's mother. Listen, Christopher. You were very young back then, and you couldn't remember anything before the accident. Maybe you have some old photos? Or documents? Anything? He shook his head. We don't have any photos. Everything burned in a fire a year after our parents died, including the documents. Grandma even had to restore them and get guardianship over us. Jenna thought for a moment. There were still too many unanswered questions in this story. But now everything was in the hands of the private detective. Jenna wished Christopher strength and patience before leaving the on-call room. In the hallway, Brian was waiting for her. Jenna, I need to talk to you. The anesthesiologist looked very nervous. Listen, he continued. I understand everything. You covered for me, and I'm really grateful for that, though I acted like a coward. I got scared, I panicked. I have kids, you know? I can't lose my job. Jenna shook her head. What else can be said? Brian looked even more despondent. I know I'm guilty, and I'm ready to take responsibility. I'll tell everything at the trial, and that will be the end of it. Then, whatever happens, happens. You believe me, I can't sleep. This situation keeps coming to me in dreams. And that patient, well, there was no saving him anyway, but we took the risk. My mistake didn't change anything. The internal investigation showed that. But how do you prove that to his family? And your ex-husband, he's holding on like a bulldog. Jenna sighed. She really had no idea what to do next. On one hand, she was still upset with Brian, but on the other, she felt sorry for him. Jenna returned to her office, sat at her desk, and closed her eyes. Her head was pounding. She thought about Jonathan, Christopher, Grace's deceit, and, of course, the upcoming trial. But what kept bothering her the most was little Tyler with Charlie. Tomorrow, she would definitely go with him to the guardianship council, but for today, he would stay with her. Jenna looked at the clock. It was time to go home. That was enough operations and secrets for one day. At home, a pair of waiting eyes awaited her. She hoped Charlie hadn't managed to chew through her old house slippers. Hugging the boy, Jenna felt like her heart was finally thawing. Only 34 years old, but before meeting Tyler, she had lived like a recluse. The star at work, yet no one to share her joy with at home. The next morning, Jenna arrived for her shift with a bad premonition, and as it turned out, she was right. In Jonathan's room, there was a surprise waiting for her, a guest who wasn't invited. Sitting in a chair, absent-mindedly smiling, was a middle-aged man in a worn but sturdy jacket. Jonathan was still asleep. Good afternoon. You must be Jenna Russell? The guest said, extending his hand. Cameron Hall, private detective. Jenna became cautious. What are you doing here? Jonathan hired me, the detective explained. There are some questions regarding his family. Jenna sat down on the couch, gesturing that she was ready to listen. The thing is, your patient, Jonathan, and his so-called brother, Christopher, aren't related at all, Cameron began, staring at her. Jenna frowned. I figured that out from the blood test. So what's the deal? The detective clasped his hands together. You see, Grace, their so-called grandmother, is far from an angel. I conducted an investigation and found out that in the past, she had been convicted twice for fraud. Can you believe that? And she's not their grandmother at all, she was a maid in Jonathan's parents' household, who died in an accident. The detective's words hit like thunder on a clear day. But what's even more interesting is ahead, the detective perked up. Grace swapped Christopher for another boy from an orphanage on purpose, to eventually drive a wedge between the two sons of the household and prevent them from reconciling. Perhaps she wants to claim their inheritance or something else, I don't know yet. Jenna was silent, trying to digest what she had just heard. She felt the blood draining from her face. This is just monstrous. she whispered. At that moment, Jonathan stirred in his bed and slowly opened his eyes. Jonathan? You must have heard everything? Jenna addressed him. I'm sorry that we're discussing this in front of you. But the businessman only nodded. His gaze became as hard as steel. Does Christopher know? Jenna asked the detective softly. Cameron shook his head negatively. No, I doubt I'll be able to explain everything to him properly. I'm afraid this will be a huge blow to him. We need to inform the police, said Jenna. This woman is dangerous. I think you're right, Jonathan spoke up, but first, I'll figure everything out myself, and then, if necessary, I'll go to the authorities. The last thing I need is for all the tabloids to start writing about me. Jenna carefully squeezed his hand. Be careful. The surgery went well, but there could be complications. Thank you, I'll keep that in mind, the businessman replied. And thank you for everything. Gratitude flickered in Jonathan's eyes, along with something else, something indescribable, which made Jenna's breath catch. Suddenly, she felt her heart beating faster, like in her youth on her first date. Deep down, she understood, it was quite dangerous. But at the same time, it was so alluring that her head was spinning with happiness. A couple of days later, the police arrested Grace. Jenna even attended the interrogation. The elderly woman, broken and terrified by the pressure of the information the detective had gathered, confessed to everything. Wiping away tears, the elderly fraudster revealed how she had worked as a maid for Christopher and Jonathan's parents, and how they had tragically died. Driven by greed, she decided to infiltrate their lives. It all came down to one thing: greed. A desire for easy money. The boy's parents were wealthy, and Grace dreamed of an easy life. She had planned it all. The child she brought from the orphanage was supposed to entangle Jonathan in the future. This former orphan, now an intern in the surgery department, Christopher, was supposed to always depend on the grandmother, meaning she would always have power over him. Meanwhile, the real Christopher had grown up in a foster family, taken in by new parents. Grace believed that this way, she could manipulate the brothers' fortunes once they found out they weren't biological siblings. When Jenna first learned of this, she was filled with indescribable fury. I hated their parents, Grace confessed. I wanted to get revenge. I dreamed of seeing those rich people suffer even after their deaths. Jenna looked at her with a mix of disgust and pity. She was stunned by how sophisticated vengeance could be. A month passed unnoticed. Jenna once again stood before the court. This time, everything was different, not according to her ex-husband's script. Brian, tormented by guilt, honestly admitted his mistake under the roar of the courtroom. The anesthesiologist explained that he was partially at fault for violating the instructions. He also explained that he didn't want any publicity because he had recently become the father of triplets, and without a job, he couldn't provide for them. To the huge surprise of Nicholas, the court acquitted his ex-wife to the sound of applause from the courtroom. Jenna couldn't hold back her tears of joy, while Nicholas sat with his head lowered, clearly wounded and defeated. But for him, the surprises of fate had just begun. After the trial, a private detective approached the astonished ex-husband. Clearing his throat awkwardly, Cameron explained that, in fact, he was Jonathan's real brother. Grace had swapped him in the orphanage for another boy, whom she later passed off as Christopher, who became the intern. Nicholas was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Finally, the young lawyer understood why, all these years, he had felt so alone, lost, and divided. Jenna watched her ex-husband with pain in her heart, but she still couldn't forgive him for his betrayal and infidelity. A few months after the trial, her life had changed. Jenna continued working at the clinic, where she was valued and respected. Many of her patients continued to become her friends. Meanwhile, Jonathan, having recovered, proposed to her. The businessman confessed his love and said he couldn't bear to spend another day without her. Jenna cried tears of happiness, for she had come to love Jonathan as well. And she realized that life had given her a second chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Jenna and Jonathan got married, and Tyler became their son. Jenna loved the boy so much that she considered him her own. As for Nicholas, he couldn't accept his newly found brother and moved to another city, where his career ultimately failed. Especially since Jonathan still considered Christopher his brother. Jenna, on the other hand, felt loved, protected, and was preparing to become a mother once again. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.